My sister planned her wedding on the exact same day as mine, on purpose. She wanted to steal my moment, my family, and maybe even my fiancé's attention. When I first saw her announcement, I actually laughed. It was too absurd to be real. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping coffee, scrolling through Instagram when her save the date popped up. Same date, same time. My stomach dropped. I called her immediately. She answered like nothing was wrong. "Oh my gosh, Harper. Isn't that funny? We picked the same day. What are the odds?" Her voice was sugary sweet, but I heard the satisfaction underneath. I knew Paige too well. She'd always had a way of turning everything into a competition. In school, she had to get better grades. At family gatherings, she had to dress better. And now, she had to have a bigger, flashier wedding. I told my parents, expecting outrage or at least mild concern, but they just smiled and said, "It's such a coincidence, honey. Don't make this into a thing." My mom even laughed, adding, "Paige's ceremony will be at the country club, but yours will be lovely too, dear." That word, too, stuck like a thorn. For months, I'd been carefully planning a small garden wedding behind my aunt's house in Savannah. I didn't want grandeur. I wanted intimacy, fairy lights, wildflowers, the smell of magnolia trees in late spring. Evan and I agreed it should feel like us, quiet, meaningful, grounded. But with one announcement, Paige turned everything into a side-by-side comparison. Suddenly, relatives started asking if I was sure I didn't want to move my date. "You don't want to make people choose, Harper," they said, as if I were the one creating conflict. My cousin even mentioned that Paige's dress was being custom-made in New York, then quickly added, "I'm sure yours will be beautiful too." Evan told me to ignore it. He said Paige was just being Paige, and he didn't want me stressed. But deep down, I saw something flicker in his eyes when my mother talked about Paige's flair for celebration. Maybe it was admiration. Maybe curiosity. Either way, it hurt. The truth was, I'd seen this pattern my whole life. Paige couldn't stand when I had something she didn't. Even something as simple as peace. When I got engaged before her, she smiled for the photos but later whispered, "Guess I'll have to beat your wedding." I thought it was a joke. I should have known better. That night, I sat on the porch, the humid Georgia air pressing against my skin, listening to crickets buzz. I thought about calling her, confronting her, screaming even. But then I remembered every time she'd stolen something from me, and how she always managed to look like the victim afterward. So I decided to stay quiet. Not because I forgave her, but because I wanted to see just how far she was willing to go this time. The comparison started the moment Paige's engagement hit the family chat. Suddenly, everything was Paige's this and Paige's that. My parents couldn't stop raving about her country club venue, the string quartet, the custom floral arrangements. Every conversation turned into a subtle ranking, and I always came second. My own plans, the backyard garden ceremony Evan and I had worked so hard on, became an afterthought. One afternoon, I walked into my parents' kitchen just in time to hear my mother say, "Paige's wedding will be more memorable. She always had flair." She didn't notice me standing there until she turned around. Her face froze for a second, but she didn't apologize. She just smiled that soft, patronizing smile and said, "You know what I mean, dear. Yours will be sweet. Sweet. Like a consolation prize." That word sat in my stomach for days. Sweet meant small. Sweet meant forgettable. And even though Evan kept telling me not to care, I could see it in his eyes sometimes. A quiet intrigue when Paige's bold choices came up. She'd chosen a designer gown, a grand entrance, fireworks. I caught him scrolling through photos of elaborate weddings one night, and when I asked why, he said, "Just looking for ideas." I wanted to believe him. Then the envelope arrived. I almost didn't open it. Inside was Paige's wedding invitation, printed on thick ivory paper with gold lettering. I stared at it for a long time, confused at first, until I realized what she'd done. She'd actually sent me an invitation, as if I were a guest. The audacity was breathtaking. There was even a handwritten note at the bottom. "Can't wait to see what you wear." That was the moment something shifted. This wasn't coincidence or even competition anymore. There was something deeper behind it, a quiet grudge, a score she'd been waiting years to settle. The air in my parents' house felt heavier every time I visited. My mother fussed over seating charts for Paige. My father talked about the golf course views, and nobody mentioned my wedding unless I brought it up first. My aunt tried to stay neutral, but even she said, "You know how your sister gets. Just let her have her show." At night, when I lay awake beside Evan, the silence between us stretched. He was supportive in words but distant in energy, as if the whole thing embarrassed him. I started wondering if Paige's confidence, the same smugness I'd always despised, secretly impressed him too. I could feel myself fading from the family picture, like my presence had been edited out. The more they hyped her up, the smaller I became. And yet, under the sadness, anger was beginning to stir. A quiet, patient anger that told me this wasn't over. Something inside me whispered that Paige didn't just want attention. She wanted payback. For what? I didn't know yet. But I was going to find out. Back then, everything revolved around Paige. She walked into any room like she owned it, hair perfect, smile practiced, eyes already searching for whoever would admire her first. Teachers adored her. Boys followed her around like she was sunlight. I was just there, quieter, more cautious, invisible next to her glow. When I was 16, I started dating a boy named Ryan. He wasn't anything extraordinary, kind eyes, nervous laugh, always smelled faintly of mint. For once, I felt like I had something that was mine. But it didn't last long. Paige showed up at one of his basketball games wearing my jacket, smiling that sly, knowing smile. A week later, Ryan stopped calling. When I finally asked him why, he said, "Your sister's easier to talk to." Paige laughed when I confronted her, flipping her hair over her shoulder like it was a joke. "Oh, Harp," she said, "you know how boys are. Don't take it so seriously." It wasn't just the boys. It was everything. When I won a small art competition, she managed to turn it into her moment by announcing she'd been selected for homecoming court the same day. My mother clapped for both of us, but hugged Paige first. "You know, she's always been more outgoing," she'd say whenever I got quiet. "Don't be sensitive." That phrase became my whole childhood. Don't be sensitive. Don't make things hard. Don't start drama. So I learned to shrink myself to keep the peace. The worst memory came a few weeks before she left for college. I was packing her things into boxes while she lounged on the bed, painting her nails, talking about how excited she was to finally do something big. I remember saying softly, "I'll miss you." She smiled, but not kindly. "You'll be fine," she said, blowing on her nails. "You'll always be my shadow, Harp. That's your thing." I laughed it off then, pretending it didn't sting. But those words stuck. Every time she got something I wanted, a compliment, a promotion, even attention from our parents, I'd hear that line again, echoing in the back of my head. When she came home for holidays, she'd tell stories about her life like a performance. Everyone hung on her every word. I sat beside her, smiling at the right moments, nodding on cue, playing my role as the quieter one. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. That being different was okay. That peace was better than pride. But sitting here now, years later, with our weddings set on the same day, her doing, not fate, I realized that all my silence ever did was teach her she could keep taking. That day in the kitchen, after my mother's latest comment about Paige's flair, I finally felt something solid forming inside me. I wasn't going to be her shadow anymore. Not this time. Not ever again. The first crack came with a text from my wedding planner. She said she couldn't continue. A scheduling conflict came up. When I called her, her voice was shaky, apologetic. "Paige reached out," she finally admitted. "She offered double my rate to handle her event instead. I can't turn that down, Harper. I'm so sorry." I hung up before she could say more. The next morning, the florist canceled. "We're suddenly overbooked that weekend," they said. The caterer followed, then the rental company. Every call sounded rehearsed, every excuse identical. By the third cancellation, I didn't need confirmation. I knew exactly what was happening. Paige was clearing the field one vendor at a time, turning my wedding day into a logistical nightmare. I sat on the couch surrounded by contracts, deposit receipts, and silence. Evan came home to find me staring at the list of vendors, all crossed out. When I told him, he rubbed his temples, pacing. "Maybe we should just postpone," he said softly. "Let this blow over. It's too stressful." His words landed like a stone. Postpone. Give up. Let her win. Something in me broke then, not the fragile, teary kind of break, but the quiet, final kind. For weeks, I'd tried to hold it together, to be the reasonable one. But watching everything I'd built fall apart because of her greed and spite flipped a switch I didn't know I had. I went to the window, looking out at the yard where our ceremony was supposed to happen. The string lights were still packed in boxes, the arch unbuilt, the garden bare. It should have made me cry, but instead I felt still cold even. Paige had always thrived on being one step ahead, stealing the spotlight before I even reached it. This time, she wasn't just outshining me, she was dismantling me piece by piece. But she'd forgotten something. I wasn't the same girl who stayed silent while she laughed at my pain. I wasn't her shadow anymore. When Evan said again, "It's not worth the fight," I turned to him and smiled, small, controlled. "Oh, it's worth it." He didn't understand what I meant, and I didn't explain. There was nothing left to explain. I spent that night sitting at my desk, replaying every cancellation, every smug word, every reminder that she thought she could take everything from me. Somewhere between anger and clarity, a new thought settled in. If Paige wanted a war, she'd get one. But it wouldn't be the kind she expected. I opened my laptop, started listing names. People she trusted, people who owed her favors, people who talked too much when wine was involved. I didn't know what the plan was yet, only that there would be one. Because if she wanted to make my wedding a competition, I was going to make sure it ended with her losing everything she'd tried to take. I started digging in the quiet hours, nosing around I'd sworn I wasn't capable of. A friend at the estate where Paige had booked everything. Someone who owed me a favor from college, slipped me details in hushed messages. I didn't ask for much, names, schedules, tiny oddities that might be useful. She sent back a string of notes like breadcrumbs. At first it was small stuff. Extra rehearsal time, an offhand comment about a bridesmaid who'd flown in early, a vendor who preferred private conversations. Then a line in one message made my chest tighten. The woman standing next to Paige in the photos, the one who laughed at her jokes and helped pin the veil, had a history with the groom. Not an old acquaintance, something current, messy in a way that looked like a secret still breathing. I read the screenshots twice. The man, Caleb, was still exchanging late-night texts with her. The messages were flirty, familiar, and the kind that suggested endings planned then postponed. There were plans to meet, jokes about their private code words, an affection that read like a promise they weren't finished keeping. The realization landed like an object thrown through glass. This wasn't just a slip-up. It was betrayal in progress. My hands shook as I scrolled through the evidence. I'd found ammunition so potent it could overturn an entire afternoon. My brain started a list of consequences as if cataloging explosives. If I exposed this, the spectacle would be immediate. Accusations, tears, a wedding halted, reputations shredded. If I kept it to myself, the humiliation would still happen, but to someone else, a steady, gnawing ache as Paige walked down the aisle with an actor beside her. Morality and retribution tangled in my head. I pictured old versions of myself, the one who swallowed grievances to keep the wheels greased. She would have walked away, closed the book, and pretended she wasn't burning. But the present me refused that old compromise. I'd spent years playing small to preserve harmony, and harmony had been weaponized against me. The choice sharpened, justice that soothed or revenge that satisfied. I called the friend again, asking for verification without sounding frantic. She confirmed the timeline, forwarded another exchange where the other woman hinted she wouldn't attend unless something changed between her and Caleb. That line changed everything. It meant not only infidelity but a lever that could be pulled. I lay awake drafting possible approaches. Public confrontation would be brutal and decisive. A private warning might spare some dignity, but leave Paige protected by plausible deniability. I measured both options like a surgeon deciding where to cut. Finally, staring at the ceiling, I promised myself a lesson. Not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a reckoning that reflected the hurt I'd carried. If the wedding was to be remembered, let it be for the truth revealed, not for the spectacle Paige intended. This time, I would not be erased. 2 weeks left. Every conversation felt like a performance now. Rehearsed smiles, polite nods, tension simmering beneath the surface. Family dinners were unbearable. My mother fussed about floral arrangements and menu choices, always ending with, Paige's planner suggested something similar. My father kept saying, "It's going to be a beautiful weekend for both of you," as if that could disguise the quiet panic in his tone. Paige, for her part, looked radiant in that practiced, hollow way she had when everything wasn't quite under control. She tried to bait me with questions about my little garden setup, calling it sweet again, just to twist the knife. But I didn't flinch. I smiled, nodded, and said, "I'm sure yours will be unforgettable." That made her pause. She couldn't read me anymore, and that unsettled her more than anger ever could. On the surface, I was calm, serene even. Underneath, I was gathering threads. I'd already learned enough to know that Caleb wasn't the golden fiancé Paige wanted the world to see. But I needed confirmation from the only person who could give it. I found Lila's number through mutual friends. It took 3 attempts before she agreed to meet. We chose a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place where no one from our circles would wander in. She arrived wary, scanning the room like she might bolt. When she finally sat, I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, not anger, just a deep weariness. I didn't waste time. "I know about you and Caleb," I said softly. Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't deny it. After a long silence, she exhaled and whispered, "He told me he'd end it after the wedding. He needs her family's money to pay off debts from his business. He said once that's settled, we'd figure things out." Each word felt like a match dropped on dry grass. Paige wasn't just marrying a liar. She was marrying someone who saw her as a transaction. All her scheming, all her sabotage, and she hadn't even noticed the ground collapsing under her own feet. Lila's voice cracked when she added, "I think he's serious about taking her money. He said she's too self-absorbed to notice." I believed it. That sounded exactly like Caleb, smooth, calculating, opportunistic. For a moment, I felt pity. Not for him, not for Lila, but for Paige. Because as much as she'd hurt me, she didn't deserve the humiliation waiting for her. But pity fades fast when you remember what betrayal feels like. Before we left, I told Lila one thing. "You'll want to be there when it happens." She looked confused, hesitant to ask what I meant. I didn't explain. I just smiled and paid for her coffee. Walking out into the late afternoon heat, I felt the stillness before something inevitable. That heavy, perfect calm the world holds right before a storm breaks. The morning came thick with humidity, the kind that clings to skin and slows every breath. My phone buzzed nonstop, family group chats, last-minute calls, reminders. Everyone was running between both events, trying to play neutral. My mother's voice, frantic in one message, said, "Just stay calm, sweetheart. It's a big day for everyone. For everyone. Never just for me." At my aunt's house, the garden was alive. The flowers we'd planted months ago had opened perfectly, as if timed for this moment. Chairs lined the lawn in neat rows, ribbons catching in the breeze. My friends moved quietly, adjusting centerpieces, smoothing tablecloths. The simplicity of it all made it feel sacred. There was no noise, no spotlight, just warmth. Inside, my aunt pinned the last of the blossoms in my hair. "You look steady," she whispered. I smiled. I was steady. For the first time in weeks, my heartbeat wasn't racing. It was slow, deliberate. Everything was already in motion. Across town, Paige's event had started an hour later. I'd heard it would be extravagant, chandeliers strung from tents, white horses for photos, a champagne fountain that cost more than my entire ceremony. None of that mattered now. The difference between us had never been clearer. She wanted spectacle. I wanted peace. Evan waited under the arch, his suit crisp, his expression gentle but uncertain. The guests murmured softly, the music cue beginning. I walked down the short path, the grass cool beneath my shoes, my eyes locked on his. My phone was tucked into the small clutch my cousin held beside me. Screen dark, a timer running silently in the background. I'd scheduled it the night before. One message, one moment. The text contained the truth. Screenshots of Caleb's late-night exchanges, every line dripping with betrayal. His words to Lila, promises of after the wedding, of using Paige's connections to clear his debts. It was set to send at 1 p.m., precisely when Paige's ceremony would begin. As the officiant began speaking, I listened, but part of me drifted elsewhere, to the country club across town, to my sister standing in her gown, surrounded by cameras and applause. I could almost see her checking her phone, the exact second her smile would falter. The vows began. Evan's voice shook with emotion, soft and earnest. When it was my turn, I inhaled deeply, steadying my hands. My cousin's phone lit up briefly beside me. The notification confirming the message had been delivered. A small vibration, nothing more. I looked at Evan, then at the faces around me, glowing in the golden light. For a moment, everything stood still, a perfect balance between serenity and inevitability. Somewhere across town, chaos was already blooming, but here, in this quiet garden, the world felt weightless. I said my vows clearly, my voice unwavering. Peace had never felt so much like power. While I stood under the arch reciting my vows, the world across town split open. I didn't see it, but I could almost feel the ripple of noise, gasps, whispers, the sharp crack of someone shouting through a microphone. The timing was exact. Paige would have been just stepping into the aisle, bouquet trembling in her hands, smile fixed for the cameras. Then her phone would have buzzed. One glance. 1 second. That's all it took. The next part played out through murmurs that drifted into my ceremony like distant thunder. A guest's phone buzzed, another leaned in to whisper, and my aunt's brow furrowed slightly. She leaned toward me when the applause faded and murmured, "Something's going on at Paige's wedding." I nodded as if I'd already known, because I had. Later I'd hear the full version. How she'd stopped mid-aisle, face pale, eyes blazing at Caleb. How she demanded the band stop playing and shouted at him in front of everyone. Guests frozen, phones lifted. Caleb denying, Paige screaming, "You liar!" Her voice echoing through that perfect white tent she'd bragged about for months. His parents, humiliated, stepping forward to announce they were cutting ties, funds, and every ounce of support they'd promised. By the time we were sharing our first dance, news had already begun spreading. My aunt's phone buzzed again, her eyes widening as she mouthed, "It's bad." I smiled faintly, resting my head against Evan's shoulder. The music kept playing. The garden lights glowed softly, and the laughter around us felt untouched, safe. When the night had thinned to only a handful of guests, headlights cut across the yard. Paige stumbled out of a car, still in her gown, the hem muddied, her makeup streaked down her face. The chatter stopped. She looked like she'd walked straight out of a battlefield. She didn't bother with greetings. "You did this," she hissed, voice hoarse. "You couldn't let me have one day, could you?" Her hands shook as she pointed at me. I didn't move. For a moment, nobody breathed. Evan stepped closer, but I lifted a hand to stop him. I met her eyes, wild, furious, terrified, and spoke softly. "You picked the day, Paige. I just made sure it was unforgettable." The silence that followed was heavier than shouting could have been. She blinked, stunned, then turned and stormed off into the dark, her train dragging through the damp grass. The car door slammed, tires screeched, and the night swallowed her whole. Around me, no one spoke. The music resumed faintly, laughter hesitantly returning. I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. Just quiet, a kind of stillness that comes after the wind tears through everything and finally settles. The sky was full of stars, the air finally cool. Somewhere, the echoes of her chaos were still unraveling, but here in the garden, peace held its ground. Weeks passed in a blur of quiet beaches and distant skies. The air on the island carried none of the tension that had shadowed the last few months. Evan and I moved through the days slowly. Sunrises over the water, long walks without talking about home. The storm had broken, and all that remained was calm. Neither of us mentioned Paige. Her name sat between us like a ghost, unspoken but present. I'd stopped checking my phone constantly, though headlines from Savannah still appeared. Whispers about a canceled wedding, guests demanding refunds, gossip spiraling through the town like wildfire. Paige's silence was louder than any apology could have been. She'd disappeared from social media, her once perfect image crumbling overnight. At first, I felt nothing. Not victory, not regret. Just emptiness. Revenge had a strange aftertaste, satisfying at first, then strangely hollow. I'd imagined I'd feel lighter when the truth came out, but instead, it felt like the air after lightning. Clear but charged, carrying the smell of something burned. One afternoon, while Evan napped, my phone rang. My mother's voice trembled on the other end. "I should have seen it sooner," she said softly. "I thought she was strong, but she's been cruel, especially to you." Her words stumbled between guilt and realization. "I'm sorry, Harper. You didn't deserve that." For a moment, I didn't respond. Part of me wanted to remind her of every time she'd chosen Paige's side, every slight she'd brushed off. But instead, I just said, I needed her to learn the way I did. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. Just truth. There was a pause, long enough to feel like understanding, and then a quiet sniffle before the line clicked off. I sat there, phone still in hand, staring at the horizon. The ocean didn't care about family drama or ruined weddings. It just kept moving, wave after wave, endless and steady. That night, Evan reached for my hand as we watched the sun sink into the water. He didn't ask about Paige, and I didn't offer. For the first time, silence felt like peace, not suppression. The ache that used to live in my chest had dulled to something bearable. Not gone, but no longer sharp. Back home, people would still talk. They'd trade versions of the story, attach names, twist motives. Let them. The truth had already done its work. Paige had finally felt what I'd felt all my life. The sting of being unseen, the pain of realizing someone else held the power to undo you. Closure didn't come with fireworks. It came in small breaths, in the way the tide erased footprints overnight. I didn't need to win. I just needed it to be over. The house felt different when we came back, quieter, lighter. The chaos had drained out of the walls, leaving behind only stillness. Evan unpacked slowly, humming to himself, while I wandered into the backyard. The arch from our wedding still stood, its flowers browned at the edges but somehow beautiful in their fading. The breeze moved through them gently, as if reminding me that even endings can look soft. A few days later, a letter arrived. Paige's handwriting was sharp, deliberate, the kind that always looked like she wanted every word to stab. I stood at the kitchen counter, turning the envelope in my hands. Evan looked up, but I shook my head. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. There would be no apology, only resentment disguised as explanation. That was how she'd always been. I slid it into the drawer with the takeout menus and old receipts, and closed it quietly. Some doors don't need to be reopened. The days slipped into a calm rhythm. I started tending to the garden again, pruning, watering, rebuilding small things. The ground beneath the arch was soft from rain, and I planted new seeds there, unsure what they'd grow into. Evan joined me sometimes, his hand brushing mine in silence. We didn't talk about Paige anymore. There was nothing left to say. In quiet moments, though, I thought about her. Not with hate, just with the strange ache of loss. Not for the sister she was, but for the one she never became. I wondered if she thought of me too, or if she'd buried me in her bitterness the way I'd tried to bury her in my forgiveness. Maybe that was what family did, built walls out of love, and then forgot how to tear them down. I used to believe revenge would fix something inside me, that making her hurt would balance what she'd taken. But standing in that garden, I realized it hadn't healed anything. It had only exposed the truth, that I didn't need her approval anymore, or her rivalry to measure my worth. I'd spent too many years trying to be seen in her light when all along, I just needed my own. The sun slipped lower through the trees, catching the edges of the arch in gold. I brushed my fingers along one of the wilting roses and let out a breath that felt like release. Maybe this was peace, not forgetting, not forgiving, but finally being free. Sometimes you have to lose your sister to find yourself. And though it hurt more than I ever imagined, standing there in that fading light, I knew I'd finally found me. Do you think Harper went too far? Or was it the only way her sister would ever learn? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me what you'd have done in her place.